the Monroe Doctrine and U.S. paternalism, and all the baggage of the Monroe Doctrine, which has been used to justify interventions in the Dominican Republic, Nicaragua, Grenada.
The resentment of the U.S. as the hegemon.
Sure.
And, the Monroe Doctrine, which basically said that is our backyard and we need to control it and so forth.
Aggressive in Latin America, and we see more and more U.S. politicians invoke the Monroe Doctrine, which has its 200th anniversary next year. And this is a 200-year-old colonial doctrine.
In Latin America, is destabilization still on the agenda, or is the Monroe Doctrine dead or in need of being retooled?
So, the vast majority of us have absolutely no idea of what Monroe actually said. And even though we think we know what he was getting at, what we think is actually the polar opposite of what Monroe actually said. Whereas everyone thinks that Monroe said that the U.S. gets to decide what flies and what doesn't fly in America's backyard, i.e., the Americas. In fact, what he said is that we need to respect the sovereignty of independent republics in the Western Hemisphere. And who was he speaking to when he said this? He was speaking to Europe, to the European powers, and telling them in very direct terms that they would no longer be allowed to conquer or colonize independent republics in the Western Hemisphere. Because colonialism and monarchy, or more of that system in the Western Hemisphere than there already was. The European powers were already in the Caribbean and other little places, still going into the 1820s. But more monarchism or more colonialism would be felt as a threat to the existence of the United States of America. So, we'll get into any details or gray areas, and we'll take a look at who James Monroe was. Because I bet you he's not who you think he was. Leftists likely think he was just a rich, racist aristocrat, and libertarians probably think he was just another follower of Jefferson, Madison, free trade, and state rights. Neither of those are true. Well, okay, was he rich? Yes. Was he an aristocrat? Yes, we could say yes. But his values and his policies didn't fit the mold of what you would assume from that. His Secretary of State was John Quincy Adams, son of John Adams. And he was allies with the Speaker of the House at that time, Henry Clay. And those two guys, JQA and Henry Clay, were the spearheads of a movement that was popular at that time. And it gained popularity during Monroe's 2 terms. And it's a movement that most of us today don't even realize existed. Or if you did happen to learn about it in high school history class, it was likely glossed over or whitewashed and probably had all the importance sucked out of it. But that movement was something that Henry Clay called the American system. In the same year that James Monroe gave this speech, which we now think of as, quote unquote, the Monroe Doctrine, Henry Clay gave a speech in Congress about, quote, the American system. Now, leftists, don't cringe. You got to come to things with an open mind. American system back then did not have the connotation what American system has now. So I would urge people to enter with an open mind. And by the way, that movement, what we might call the American system, is actually well and alive today, but not so much in the United States. So we're going to get into that too, so we can see where it's being used today and why it's important for us today. We're going to get into John Quincy Adams a bit. We're going to get into Henry Clay and the American system philosophy and the movement as it was back in the 1810s, 1820s, back at the time of Monroe's presidency. So this is the Monroe Doctrine. And most of us, including myself, don't even make it this far to just read these 3 short quotes. But the extent to which most of us get is just hearing that U.S. presidents throughout history have invoked the Monroe Doctrine in order to do what they wanted to countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. So let's go a little further than that. So these three quotes are actually part of this speech, which is President Monroe's State of the Union address to Congress in 1823. And we're going to take a look at some excerpts from it. But I think it's worth mentioning that John Quincy Adams wrote this speech for Monroe. Both of them were intelligent guys. It's not like Dick Cheney creating policy for George W. Bush. It's more like Monroe had confidence in John Quincy Adams' abilities, and they worked in partnership with each other, and I'm sure they conferred with each other during the writing of the speech, but John Quincy Adams did write it. All right, so this excerpt is thought of as being part of the Monroe Doctrine as it's thought of today by historians. So, as a principle in which the rights and interests of the United States are involved, that the American continents, by the free and independent condition which they have assumed and maintain, are henceforth not to be considered as subjects for future colonization by European powers. All right, when he says the American continents, by the free and independent condition which they have assumed and maintained, that's because basically in the decade prior to this speech, most of South America had basically kicked Spain out and become independent republics. We're talking about Peru, Colombia, Chile, Argentina. They were all independent republics at the time, and they had been recognized by the United States as sovereign nations a year or two before this speech. But this excerpt, this part of the speech, was being addressed specifically to the Russian Tsar, because at the time, Russia still had ambitions of trying to take part of the northwestern part of North America for themselves. But you can see clearly right here that he's also talking to all European powers. Okay, moving on to another excerpt. The citizens of the United States cherish sentiments the most friendly in favor of the liberty and happiness of their fellow men on that side of the Atlantic. In the wars of the European powers in matters relating to themselves, we have never taken any part, nor does it comport with our policy so to do. So in European wars, whether they be citizen revolutions against the ruling monarchs, or whether it be Napoleon versus Britain, U.S. has always stayed neutral. It is only when our rights are invaded or seriously menaced that we resent injuries or make preparation for our defense. With the movements in this hemisphere, we are of necessity more immediately connected, and by causes which must be obvious to all enlightened and impartial observers. So modern people, we're so used to the U.S. being thought of as a major power. And in most of the 20th and 21st centuries, a major imperialist power. But back then, the major powers were Britain and some European players. And the U.S. was just trying to hang on. So that's why he's saying that it must be obvious to all enlightened and impartial observers that more new colonizing and reconquering of independent republics in the Americas would be a threat to the U.S. They already have the British in Canada, right to the north of them on their border. So they're already nervous about being reconquered, and the last thing they need are more colonizing European powers pushing up towards their republic from the south. All right, the political system of the Allied powers is essentially different in this respect from that of America. By America, he's talking about North and South America, not the U.S. This difference proceeds from that which exists in their respective governments. Going down here, we should consider any attempt on their part to extend their system, monarchy, colonialism, that's what he means by their system, to extend their system to any portion of this hemisphere as dangerous to our peace and safety. With the existing colonies or dependencies of any European power, we have not interfered and shall not interfere. But with the governments who have declared their independence and maintained it, we cannot view any interposition for the purpose of oppressing them or controlling in any other manner their destiny by any European power in any other light than as the manifestation of an unfriendly disposition towards the United States. All right, but just so you know, when he talks about the Allied powers, he's referring to ongoing talks at the time between something called the Holy Alliance and the Bourbon Restoration. So this dynastic monarchical lineage called the House of Bourbon, they had regained control in France and Spain at that time. And so those two nations had restored friendly relations with each other. Russia, Prussia, and the Habsburgs in Austria had formed something called the Holy Alliance. And they had actually made a pact between them that they would squash any popular uprisings within their borders. So they would send their army to the other countries if there were any citizen revolutions against the monarchs. And there were rumors and or talks at that time between the Holy Alliance and the House of Bourbon regarding the inclusion of Spain and France in that pact to squash citizen revolutions. So, for example, if France were to have another revolution, then Russia, Prussia, and Spain would all send troops to help squash the revolution. And I would imagine that that pact would have extended to the colonies of France, Spain, and Russia as well. So that gives you a sense of why he's addressing the issue of European expansion in the New World. And that's who he's referring to when he says the Allied powers. But what he's made clear in these paragraphs is that he sees the Western Hemisphere as having a very different system of governance from Europe, the Old World. And he really views the Western Hemisphere, especially in light of all these new republics taking control in the last decade in Mexico and South America, as a new movement, really. That these new sovereign republics that make up the Americas are advancing humanity, and he doesn't want this all to be reversed by actors from the old monarchical system coming in and reconquering or colonizing for the first time. Because some European powers have never really colonized all that much of the Americas in the first place. We don't really think of them as powers nowadays, but, I mentioned, Prussia and the Habsburgs and Russia and even Sweden. So they were all powers at the time, colonizing powers. Now, he does mention here that the U.S. won't interfere with existing colonies or dependencies of European powers. So Europe still does have a lot of islands in the Caribbean, and possibly they have places that are now Suriname, Guyana, French Guyana. And so, the U.S. is by no means a powerhouse at this point compared to France and Britain and even Spain. So he's assuring the Europeans that the U.S. is not going to go and spread, the revolution to their current colonies by force. But if the revolution spreads on its own, as it did in most of South America and Mexico, and the people in those colonies take over on their own, then the U.S. is going to respect them and acknowledge them as a sovereign republic. Okay, he continues here, and this is also related to what's now called the Monroe Doctrine. It is impossible that the Allied powers should extend their political system to any portion of either continent being North or South America, without endangering our peace and happiness, our being us, the U.S. Nor can anyone believe that our southern brethren being Mexico, Central America, South America, our southern brethren, if left to themselves, would adopt it of their own accord. It is equally impossible, therefore, that we should behold such interposition in any form with indifference. So he's just reiterating what he just said above. He doesn't want that system of monarchy and colonialism reconquering or colonizing any of the established independent republics in the Americas. So what we've just covered, the passages of this State of the Union address from 1823 that we just covered, are what's now known as the Monroe Doctrine. Those were the passages, excerpts, related to sending a message to the European powers. So I'm going to show you some other excerpts from this speech that are sort of other subject matters that don't relate to the Monroe Doctrine, but just because they're really interesting, they'll show you a bit about Monroe and the movement that was going on at that time. And I haven't really decided how I'm going to edit this video yet, if it'll be 2 parts or 1, but check the video's description down below, because I may put links to sort of add-on videos, complementary videos to this video, where I'll go through some of these other parts of this speech so you can see a bit more about who Monroe was, and John Quincy Adams, he wrote the speech, and what their policies and values were. But taking what we just read, the excerpts that have specifically to do with the quote-unquote doctrine, we've seen nothing whatsoever in those excerpts that say that the U.S. will intervene in the internal affairs of any of the independent republics in the Western Hemisphere. Nowhere at all does he say that. Nowhere at all do we see that in his speech. And to the contrary, he talks about respecting the sovereignty of these independent republics. The only circumstances where he talks about the U.S. possibly intervening would be if European powers come and try to conquer new land or reconquer their old colonies. But he's very clear that that's because he doesn't want the old system of monarchy and colonialism finding its way back into the New World, back into the Western Hemisphere. Wherever revolutions overtake monarchy in the Western Hemisphere, he's saying the U.S. should sustain those revolutions so that humanity can move forward rather than regress. Now, I haven't honestly searched all that much as to when it was that U.S. presidents started, quote-unquote, invoking the Monroe Doctrine in order to intervene in the affairs of Latin America, more specifically in the affairs of independent republics in Latin America. But from as far as I can gather, it seems to me that everyone seems to point towards Theodore Roosevelt with his Roosevelt Corollary. And this was in 1905, so we're talking 80 years after Monroe gave this speech. And he sort of pronounced this corollary to the Monroe Doctrine after a couple events in Venezuela and Dominican Republic related to European powers. And I'm not going to really get into the specifics in the gray area right here, right now. But this does seem to be a major shifting point where Teddy Roosevelt is saying, we can intervene in the Americas even if it's not solely to defend an independent republic from a European power. So essentially, we should not be saying things like G.W. Bush invoked the Monroe Doctrine. We should probably be saying G.W. Bush invoked the Roosevelt Corollary. And that would be a hell of a lot more accurate. And like I said, I haven't researched this very much, this Roosevelt Corollary, or what Roosevelt said or did at the time. But I am definitely going to make an add-on video regarding what was generally happening for the USA at the turn of the 19th century into the 20th century. So I'm going to show you a pattern that existed all the way from Monroe and John Quincy Adams in the 1820s up until the turn of the century, and then right around there at Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, that's when a big shift happens. So check for that video as well. So moving on. Now remember, this speech that Monroe gave in December 1823 was basically his State of the Union address to Congress. So in State of the Union addresses, presidents address many different subjects. Even though what's now called the Monroe Doctrine came out of this speech later on, he was addressing many other things aside from just European powers and independent republics in the Americas. And if we go back to this first excerpt that we looked at, where he was addressing the Russian Tsar, and then we just scroll down a couple paragraphs, we come to another passage where he's addressing the African slave trade. And I'm actually just throwing this excerpt up as a teaser. I am going to go through this excerpt and Monroe's stance on slavery and the slave trade, but I'm going to do it in an add-on video. So check for that in the description to this video or on my second channel. The excerpts of the speech that I'm going to go through in this video have more to do with the movement that they called the American system at the time, which I mentioned a bit in the beginning of the video. And that term American system is basically synonymous with Hamiltonian economics. The economic plan that Alexander Hamilton put forward back in the 1790s when he was the Secretary of Treasury for George Washington. In a nutshell, what Hamilton did was create a central bank which could issue loans to facilitate the construction of infrastructure projects throughout the country. And he placed high import tariffs on manufactured products coming in from abroad so as to facilitate the creation and growth of more manufacturing within the U.S. itself, without these manufacturers having to deal with competition from countries that were ahead of the U.S. in terms of what we could call industrialization and development, such as England and Holland and France. And, Hamilton didn't get these ideas out of nowhere. He studied other economists' writings his whole life, and these sorts of economic policies were well known and supported by at least some people, some of the founding fathers, including George Washington. And even within the colonies that later became the U.S., Hamilton could draw from the successful economic structure of the Puritans in the Massachusetts Bay Colony going back to the 1600s. But in terms of U.S. history, Hamilton was the first guy to implement these kinds of economic policies. So we can refer to them as Hamiltonian economics. By the way, I haven't seen the play, in case you're curious. So, serving as Treasury Secretary under George Washington, Hamilton gets the green lights to implement these policies, and they're successful. So, due to that, Hamilton was a very popular political figure in the 1790s and early 1800s. Now, while Washington agreed with Federalist economic policies, and he implemented them, he held off from calling himself a Federalist because he didn't want to be officially associated with any particular political party. So that Hamilton was pretty much seen as the face of the Federalist Party. And due to his economic policies being successful for the nation, the Federalist Party was popular at the time. So much so that when Washington left office, another Federalist got elected to the presidency, and that was John Adams. Adams had run against Thomas Jefferson, who had just begun the Democratic Republican Party, which was essentially a continuation of the Anti-Federalists, which believed in small government, states' rights, etc. And this is where things began to get a bit messy, because Hamilton and Adams were the clear leaders of the Federalist Party. But the two did not like each other at all, and Hamilton didn't serve in John Adams' administration. But the thing is, the guys that served in John Adams' administration, Federalists, it's said that they were in constant communication with Hamilton. So Hamilton was kind of like the chief consultant for the administration, even though Adams was supposed to be the guy in charge. And I would imagine that ticked Adams off, but I actually don't know if Hamilton and Adams disliked each other as early as 1796, or if their dislike for each other started a couple of years later during a sea war between the US and the French. During that time, George Washington essentially appointed Hamilton Secretary of War, and Hamilton and Adams disagreed profusely on policy regarding that quasi-war, they called it. It wasn't an all-out war, but it was a war between navies at sea. But I tried to search to see if the two guys had any disagreements over economic policy, and I didn't really notice any differences. So far as I know, Adams was continuing Hamiltonian economics, which was synonymous with the economic plan of the Federalist Party at the time. So he was continuing with developing the nation and developing technology and the military. Nonetheless, the two guys didn't like each other. And Hamilton tried to use his pull within the Federalist Party to nominate not Adams, but another Federalist politician named Pinckney as the Federalist Party candidate for president in the 1800 elections, simply because he didn't want to see Adams serve a second term as president. John Adams ends up getting the nomination anyway, but the party is definitely starting to fracture. And with this growing reputation for being elitist and pro-British, which they got because they had favored a trade deal with the British over a trade deal with revolutionary France. Or in actuality, they tried to go have diplomatic talks with revolutionary France, but the revolutionaries demanded extremely high bribes just to talk with their leaders. But I digress. That was part of the propaganda regarding the reputation of the Federalist Party at the time, so a lot of the voting population believed that at the time. So even though Hamiltonian economics, aka the Federalist Economic Plan, had been really successful for the nation up to this point, and the nation had been developing faster than any of the European powers thought possible, the Jeffersonian Republicans were able to beat them in the 1800 election. But the elections weren't done once Adams was beat, because Jefferson ended up tying in votes to the guy in his party who was supposed to be the vice presidential candidate. So they had a runoff election between those two, voted on by the House of Representatives, to see who would be elected president of the United States. So we know Jefferson was all about states' rights, slavery, small government, and an agrarian society. But his new opponent, Aaron Burr, in the lead up to the runoff vote, started telling the Federalist politicians that he would just get on board with the Federalist plan if they voted for him instead of Jefferson. Burr wasn't from the South. He was from New York. And really, that's the only reason that Jefferson's party chose him as their vice presidential candidate, so that he could pull some support for them from his contacts in New York, because Jefferson and his party were mainly Virginia and Southern based. And really, Burr didn't share their aspirations for states' rights and small government. He was essentially just a power-hungry guy. And he had a fair amount of allies within the rich merchant and banking class in New York. And Hamilton knew this about him. He knew he was just a power-hungry guy. He knew he had connections to Benedict Arnold, who was an infamous American general who ended up conspiring with the British Army during the Revolutionary War. So in the US, at least, he's considered a traitor. And 2 years prior to this, while he was serving as a senator in New York State, Burr had hatched a plan to divert funds, public funds, that were allocated to a water infrastructure project in order to provide the city of New York with clean water, and he diverted these funds into the creation of the Manhattan Bank. The Manhattan Bank later became Chase Manhattan, which later became JP Morgan Chase, and it remains JP Morgan Chase to this day. And so this bank, the Manhattan Bank, was more of a speculative bank, and it became a competitor bank to the Bank of New York, which Hamilton had been instrumental in founding, and which almost served as a predecessor to the Bank of the United States, which he founded in 1789. And Hamilton and Burr were clearly on opposite sides of the coin when it came to how to use banks and how to use capitalist enterprise. Hamilton wanting to include and use the market economy and wealthy capitalists, but to steer them in the direction of productivity that would benefit everyone in the nation. And Burr, not caring about productivity nor the general welfare of the nation, just wanting to use capital for personal means and for profits, for anyone who he could ally himself with who had capital or had sway in Congress, who might be able to help him reach more powerful positions in government. Hamilton, knowing all this, knowing that Burr was merely out for personal gain, publicly threw his support to Jefferson. Even though Burr offered a deal to the Federalist Party to implement Federalist policy, which included Hamiltonian economics, if they were to support him in the runoff over Jefferson, and even though Hamilton hated Jefferson's economic policies and states' rights policies, and couldn't stand the fact that Jefferson didn't care about developing the nation at all, he still felt that Jefferson would be a better bet for keeping the nation independent than Burr. And he was able to convince a significant portion of Federalist congressmen to vote for Jefferson instead of Burr. And Jefferson won. So why am I mentioning all of this in a video about Monroe? Well, for one, it gives me the opportunity to convey to you guys that this time period wasn't quite as simple as just Federalist versus anti-Federalist, Hamilton versus Jefferson. A second reason is to show that this 1800 election, which ended up being the beginning of the end for the Federalist Party in the United States, had absolutely nothing to do with any sort of material failure of the Federalist Hamiltonian economic policy. We can chalk some of it up to a fracturing of the leadership of the party, as well as to policy decisions that had absolutely nothing to do with economics. But you get a glimpse of how it was that even if the Federalist economic policy was so successful for the nation in the 1790s, how it was that the Jeffersonian anti-Federalist model was able to take control of the policy of the country for the next 16 years after this election. And who was elected president 16 years later? Monroe. And before I transition to Monroe, I just want to mention that Hamilton, post-1800, was proven correct regarding his thoughts on Burr. There's lots of evidence to show that Burr hatched a plan along with his northern elite contacts to secede New England and New York from the US, and doing that in cooperation with the British. Hamilton foiled that plan. He was literally the guy responsible for keeping that plan from materializing, which is why Burr killed Hamilton in a duel. And then a few years after that, Burr conspired with the British again for a secessionist plot of the western states of the US, which included conquering part of Spanish-controlled Louisiana. And I'd love to go into the details of all that now, but that's not what this video is about. So maybe I'll go into it in a future video. You can let me know if that's something you might be interested in the comments. But libertarians, I want you to take note here that had he wanted to, Hamilton could have gone in and participated in these British, Burr, Wall Street conspiracy plots. Plots that would have broken off parts of the US, which would have then become either close allies with the British or literal colonies of the British, depending on which plot we're speaking about. But he chose not to, and he chose to foil these plots. So if Hamilton, generally speaking, was this guy who created this central bank as part of a London banking, Wall Street bankster conspiracy plot to overtake the United States, which is, generally speaking, what libertarians think, then those plots would have been the perfect opportunities for him to hatch his evil plan. But not only did he not partake in them, he was probably the guy in the country most responsible for those plots failing. And I mean, he gave his literal life in 1804 in order to stop Aaron Burr from becoming governor of New York. And that, more than anything, screwed up the New England secessionist plot. So the guy clearly wanted an independent, united U.S. And there's two little things that I think are important to remember. One is that there was propaganda back then. So much of the propaganda that you hear now about Hamilton being uber pro-British, being a pawn of the banking elite, that all came from newspapers such as the National Gazette, which was a project essentially of Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and their friend Philip Freneau. And another little thing to remember, my prophetic words, is that freedom is not only about individual civil rights. It's also about the freedom of a nation to develop. All right, so moving on. So in 1800, Jefferson takes the presidency for 8 years, and then Madison takes the presidency for 8 years. They both essentially have the same policies, even though the Bank of the US remained playing a role in the country until 1810, at which point Madison decided not to renew its charter. And both these guys did very little to develop the country. And, you know, that was pretty much the entire MO of their Democratic Republican Party in the early 1800s. And Monroe was in that party, and he was another guy who fought in the Revolutionary War. He was the last president to have fought in that war. And like Madison and Jefferson, he was from Virginia, and he was a slave owner. But he wasn't really too down with their small government, states' rights agenda. He believed that there was room within the limits of the Constitution for the federal government to initiate large infrastructure projects, what they called internal improvements at that time, as well as to initiate R&D projects for new technologies, new military technologies, and to build up the defenses of the nation. And he was a popular political figure. And he sought the party's nomination for president in the 1808 elections. But Madison got the nomination, and he got elected president. But for whatever reason, I'm not really sure, maybe it's just good to have popular people in your administration when you're president. Nonetheless, Madison appoints Monroe as his Secretary of State. And like I said earlier, in 1810, Madison decides not to renew the central bank's charter. So when Monroe takes on his role as Secretary of State, he's pushing within the administration for a new charter for a new central bank. And he's pushing essentially for Hamiltonian economics. But he doesn't really get the green light from Madison on implementing those policies until after the US almost gets overtaken by the British Empire in the War of 1812. And I'm going to get into Madison, Monroe, and the aftermath of the War of 1812 in part 2 of this video, or part 3, depending if I make this a 2 or 3-part video. But leading up to that war, between 1807 and 1812, there started to be some incidents between the US and Britain that inspired a really strong anti-British fervor among the majority of the population of the US, or at least among the majority of free men, mainly white men, who could vote in the US at the time. And so if you check out this 1823 elections results for the US House of Representatives, you see that the Federalists only won 24 seats compared to 189 seats for the Democratic Republicans. And this lack of popularity of the Federalist Party by the time 1823 rolled around had pretty much everything to do with the anti-British fervor that started to take hold of the country in the mid-1800s. And the fact that the majority of voters saw the Federalist Party and its rich merchant backers as acquiescing too much to the British resulted in the Federalists losing support year by year until, like you see, they were only down to 24 seats in 1823. However, within the Democratic Republican Party, party members had strong disagreements with each other, mainly about economics. So due to this nationalism and anti-British fervor, with pretty much no one wanting anything to do with the Federalist Party, everyone just moved over to the Democratic Republican Party. And within the Dem Repubs, we saw kind of like a rebirth of this major battle between Hamiltonian economics and Jeffersonian sort of free trade, decentralized states' rights economics. So the party wasn't at all unified, and there were two clear factions duking it out within the party at this point in time. And this guy, Henry Clay, Speaker of the House, he was one of the main leaders of the faction of the Democratic Republicans that wanted to implement Hamiltonian economics and develop the nation. And he had been the Speaker of the House for the majority of the time between 1811 and the time that Monroe gave this speech in 1823. So almost the whole time that Monroe served as president, 1816 to 1824, this guy Henry Clay, a very passionate Hamiltonian economics guy, was Speaker of the House. So when Monroe finished his 2 terms as president, we saw this faction create the Adams-Clay Republicans, which was John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay. And even though John Quincy Adams started out as a Federalist, the party of his father, he ended up breaking with the Federalists when these incidents with the British started happening around 1806, 1807. That's when he began splitting away from the Federalist program, the Federalist perspective, and in 1808, he left the Federalists and joined the Democratic Republicans. And that faction of the Dem Repubs, the Adams-Clay Republicans, they were heavily pushing for Hamiltonian economics. And Henry Clay, about half a year after this speech from Monroe, during a session in Congress, he dubbed this system of Hamiltonian economics the American system, which he felt was a counterweight to the British system of free trade and imperialism. So leftists, I know you're going to cringe at that name, American system, but that's because you're not understanding the times. At the time, the US was still a relatively undeveloped country. So that term, the American system, at the time carried absolutely no connotation of imperialism or having military bases all over the world, nor of Western hegemony in general. Nothing like that. But it does have a modern equivalent, and I bet you can guess what that modern equivalent is. Socialism with Chinese characteristics. So this more market-driven, socialism with Chinese characteristics, with the central government leading the way and the central bank leading the way. They developed the country, and that system they were using was essentially Hamiltonian economics. So I want to show you a description of the American system as it was thought of at the time by proponents of it. And this description was written by Abraham Lincoln's chief financial advisor, Henry Carey. And he wrote this in 1851, so 20 years later, but you still had the exact same battle going on within the country between the Jeffersonian free trade system and the Hamiltonian American system. And Henry Carey was the son of this guy, Matthew Carey, who was essentially one of the founding fathers, and he was a major ally of Ben Franklin and Alexander Hamilton. Ben Franklin, by the way, also believed in what I would call Hamiltonian economics. And in fact, Ben Franklin was one of the founding fathers who pushed really hard to give the federal government the right within the Constitution to provide for the general well-being of the country. Matthew Carey had been a Republican and a fierce opponent of British domination of Ireland. So he was a vocal leader in the struggle for Irish independence from the British Empire. That got him into trouble, and that's how he originally ended up fleeing to the US, where he essentially continued fighting the British Empire. So the US and Ireland were allies at that time, and their enemy was the United Kingdom, which was the hegemon of the time. So here's what Henry C. Carey wrote regarding the American system. Two systems are before the world. The one looks to increasing the proportion of persons and of capital engaged in trade and transportation, and therefore to diminishing the proportion engaged in producing commodities with which to trade, with necessarily diminished return to the labor of all, while the other looks to increasing the proportion engaged in the work of production and diminishing that engaged in trade and transportation with increased return to all, giving to the laborer good wages and to the owner of capital good profits. One looks to pauperism, ignorance, depopulation, and barbarism. The other in increasing wealth, comfort, intelligence, combination of action, and civilization. One looks towards universal war, the other towards universal peace. One is the English system. The other we may be proud to call the American system, for it is the only one ever devised, the tendency of which was that of elevating while equalizing the condition of man throughout the world. And let me read that end part over again. That of elevating while equalizing the condition of man throughout the world. So that was the goal of Hamiltonian economics and what Henry Clay had dubbed the American system. And this is how these guys thought of it. John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay, James Monroe, and Abraham Lincoln later on. They weren't just thinking of it in terms of trying to develop the nation for white men or certain kinds of white men. No. They had a real feeling that what they were doing was a system and a sentiment that could spread around the world and defeat monarchy, to defeat this system where the few benefit and the many toil, and to implement a productive system where everyone progresses together. So this is what was going on back then, and this is essentially what developed the United States in the 19th century. And if you haven't heard of this, or maybe if you learned of it in AP US history, if you went to high school in the US, but maybe it was glossed over and seemed not really very important, then that's for a reason, because bad forces have taken over the US. And there had always been a battle between the two systems that Henry Carey described in this passage. That's to say, there had always been a battle ever since the founding of the US. But in the last number of decades, the US has really been dominated by these forces of empire. And that's why this concept of free trade is so popular in the world right now. Because that's the theory that the US pushes and says that the US grew due to free trade, which is not true. And this concept of free trade, that came from the British originally, because they were on top, in terms of development in the 1600s, 1700s. So it was an economic theory that they could use without using force to trick people into wanting to export their raw natural resources to Britain and buying manufactured goods, which are always more expensive, from Britain. But what we just saw Carey describe in regards to the American system is a system and a sentiment that's been carried on in China ever since Deng Xiaoping took control there. Building a productive society. And even though there's not total equality, like economic equality there, they're continually elevating the living conditions of everyone. And at the same time, slowly equalizing the living conditions for everyone. And they're using a form of market economy in order to do that. Now, if you're a Marxist or a socialist, and you don't really like me comparing the American system as dubbed by Henry Clay to socialism with Chinese characteristics, well, then you don't have to listen to me. Check out Christian Parenti. Parenti is a leftist. I don't know if he considers himself a socialist, but he's absolutely an anti-imperialist leftist. And he wrote about Hamiltonian economics as a strategy for undeveloped countries that are under the boot of imperialism to develop. And I haven't read his book yet. I've read other books about Hamilton put out by American system proponents who aren't so much leftists. But I have heard some pretty long interviews with him about the book, and he really went and read Hamilton's own writings. There's something called the Report on Manufacturers that Hamilton wrote as a plan going forward for developing the U.S. And Parenti definitely analyzed that and other writings from Hamilton. So check them out if you want. Now, is there a difference between socialism with Chinese characteristics and Hamiltonian economics, aka the American system? Yes, but there's not really much difference economically speaking. The difference would be in the political structure. So, these Americans, such as the Adams-Clay Republicans, they were operating within a liberal democracy, whereas the political system of China is not a liberal democracy. We could call it a socialist democracy. And I would say what they're using is Leninism. And even they would say what they use is called Marxist-Leninism. And by the way, keep your eyes peeled on my adjunct channel or this channel for a video that I'm going to make regarding that theme, regarding why it's important for China to be using the Leninist political system rather than trying to implement Hamiltonian economics within a liberal democracy setup. But that'll be a whole other video. For right now, we're going to take a look at some excerpts of the same speech from 1823 from James Monroe, but they're going to be excerpts that have a lot more to do with Hamiltonian economics rather than the Monroe Doctrine. And you'll see this system within Monroe's and John Quincy Adams' own words. But I think I am going to take the opportunity right now to coin the phrase Hamiltonian Leninism, just to get that on the record. But I'll cover that in that add-on video.